In this video, we're going to talk about mandatory vaccine policies. Many employers have them or are thinking about them. That's coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adamson, the host of HR Shop Talk. On the show, you get expert insight into all kinds of things that have to do with HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show by clicking on the button at the bottom of the screen, or subscribe to the podcast to keep learning from my smart and experienced guests. Today, my guest is Stuart Rudner. Stuart is a lawyer based near Toronto, specializing in employment law. And he has his own YouTube channel on employment law. I'll leave a link to that YouTube channel in the description of this episode. Hi, Stuart, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on HR Shop Talk.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to this collaboration. It should be interesting just because you have so much experience doing this yourself. And though I have so many questions on this particular topic, we better not waste a second. So first question, can employers require employees to be vaccinated, and what are the limitations to that?
Yeah, so I mean, the simple answer is yes, but of course, nothing in employment law is simple, especially when it comes to COVID and vaccination. So to dig a little deeper there, I mean, it's certainly open to employers to create a vaccination policy. And in fact, we're encouraging all of our clients to have a vaccination policy. Notice I'm not saying mandatory vaccination policy, and that's very deliberate. I mean, I think it's important that people dig down or dig deeper than the headlines, because it seems like every day we've got another headline saying some other company, some other government organization is, implementing a mandatory vaccination policy. But then if you read the details, it's not really so mandatory, because most of the policies we see, what they say is that, they will be encouraging all employees to be vaccinated. And if an employee chooses not to, they'll be sent for some sort of education to help them understand the benefits and the fact that there is little risk involved. But then the question is, okay, what if the employee still continues to choose not to be vaccinated? And that's where most of these policies are pretty ambiguous. And I mean, the best example in Ontario is City of Toronto. If you read the headlines, it says City of Toronto mandates vaccination. But in the interviews with Mayor Tory, he's very clear in saying, when he's asked what will happen to employees who continue to choose not to, he'll say, we're not sure. No options are off the table yet. We're going to see. And in many cases, what businesses are doing is saying either you have to be vaccinated or you have to undergo regular testing, and there may be masking and distancing requirements as well. But it's not a situation where if you choose not to be vaccinated, you will lose your job. Some organizations have done that, but most have not.
That answers right there a whole bunch of questions. For those the employers who want to make it mandatory, does the nature of the employee's work matter?
It will in some contexts, because again, getting back to my first comment, it is open to employers to mandate vaccination. The question then becomes, as I was indicating, with the sort of false mandatory vaccination policies, what happens if an employee refuses? So first of all, we should distinguish between those who can't be vaccinated and those who choose not to be. So when I say those who can't be vaccinated, I'm talking about people who, for medical conditions, cannot be vaccinated, or for people who have legitimate religious beliefs that would preclude them from being vaccinated. Those are two grounds that are covered by human rights legislation in every province, and those people would be entitled to some sort of accommodation.
Right.
If we're talking about people who don't fall within either of those groups, but just choose for whatever reason not to be vaccinated, it's open to an employer to say, if you are not vaccinated, then you will not be able to work here anymore. You will lose your job. Now, I'll distinguish between unionized and non-unionized. If an employee is unionized, then it'll be harder to just simply terminate their employment. But for the vast majority of employees, as we often say, don't have job security. They can be let go at any time for almost any reason or no reason at all. But in that context, they would typically be entitled to some sort of severance, and it can be extensive severance. So it's not a matter of can you let them go or not. It's usually a question of how much severance are they entitled to. Where this gets really interesting, at least for people like me, is, as I'm sure you know, there's two types of dismissal in Canada. It's either with cause or without cause. So
Right.
the vast majority of dismissals are without cause, and
Right.
that's when severance arises. That's when you can let somebody go. You've got to give them severance. If you are going to dismiss someone with cause, then they're not entitled to any notice, any termination pay, any severance, anything basically. So not surprisingly, the threshold for showing that you have just cause is extremely high. I've
Yeah.
spent way too much of my career studying this issue because I've written a book on it. It's called You're Fired,
Yeah.
Just Cause for Dismissal in Canada. And it just indicates, the thickness of the book indicates how complicated this area can be. But to bring it back to your question about mandatory vaccination, I mean, here's the analysis. The analysis is that the employer gave a specific direction or created a specific policy which required vaccination. The employee refused to follow that direction or that policy. That's the classic definition of insubordination. But there's one key element here. In order to qualify as insubordination at law, the policy or the direction must be reasonable. So is it reasonable to require vaccination? And that gets back, there's a very long way of answering your question, but that gets back to your question of saying, does the individual role or job matter? Because it's going to be a lot more reasonable to say that it's required or that vaccination is required if someone is working, for example, in a long-term healthcare institution,
Right.
dealing with a vulnerable sector,
Right.
as opposed to someone who works entirely remotely and doesn't interact with anyone. So that'll be a really important factor in assessing whether you may have just cause to fire someone or not. But again, you can always let somebody go unless they are unionized.
So I think you've answered this question that I'm about to ask, but I'm going to ask it again and just sort of get that clarity. So what does a mandatory vaccination policy actually mean at an implementation level? I think what you're saying is it's not necessarily mandatory in many places, but can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what everyone is struggling with. And we're working with, we've been ridiculously busy since the start of the pandemic, but it's really, it almost seemed like it might slow down a bit, and then it kicked up to another whole other level recently with all the discussion about vaccination policies. So this is what we're doing, and we're working with our clients to help them assess, what is their goal, what are they trying to achieve, and we've also stressed the fact that it does not have to be one size fits all. So you may have a workforce that is quite diverse in terms of what they're doing, who they're interacting with, where they're working. And so as a result, your vaccination policy may differ from, for the people who are dealing with the public on a day-to-day basis versus people who can work remotely, you may have two different policies. So the first thing you're going to want to do is decide, how are things going to play out when you implement the policy? In other words, if someone chooses not to be vaccinated, what's going to happen? Is it going to be what I'll call a truly mandatory vaccination policy, where if they don't get vaccinated, they lose their job? Or is it going to be what's more common, which is that if they choose not to be vaccinated, or if they can't be vaccinated, then they will have to undergo regular testing and perhaps have other safety precautions put in place. So that's going to be the first, that's what we do first with our clients. So we sit down and walk through how this will work when they implement it. And then once we're clear, then we can draft the policy.
Speaking of testing, what have you seen in that regard? Like, the frequency of testing once a month is probably not going to cut the mustard, but once a day is not reasonable either. So what's emerging?
That's a really great question, because I have to admit, I am not a scientist or a doctor. And I've seen, certainly have not seen once a month, but I've seen once a week. I've seen every 2 or every 3 days. I'd say that's probably the most common, is testing every 2 or 3 days. But I have seen also once a week. And again, because I'm not a doctor or a scientist, I don't know what is the most efficient or the safest approach, but that's the type of thing that we're typically seeing.
Who's paying for those tests?
Usually the employer. And depending on where you are in the country, there are lots of programs around where you can get free test kits, I should say, usually for the rapid testing kits. But I know, for example, in Ontario, and particularly in York region, which is where we are, there are organizations that are providing free test kits. So So far, the cost has not been that significant because of the fact that there are free options available. But I have not seen many situations where employees are being asked to pay.
I'm only asking because in Alberta, for people refusing to get the vaccine, they are not making rapid testing available to them for free.
No, it's a great point though, because even here, like it's being made free on a commercial level. It's being made free for employers to implement
Oh,
in the workplace. So an employer can go and say, I need 100 or I need 5,000 test kits. But I can't just go there and say, hey, can I get a test kit for myself? Like that's not available. It's only being offered to the employers.
so what advice do you have to employers on implementing their vaccination policies?
I mean, a couple of things. First of all, don't blindly read the headlines. Actually, read through the details. But I guess at a broader level, and this is a point we always make, is don't make assumptions. The vast majority of the work that we do is caused by people making assumptions about what their rights are, what their obligations are, COVID or otherwise. That's how most people and most employers get themselves into trouble. And just to digress, briefly, I mean, just go back to the beginning of the pandemic when we saw all of these mass layoffs. And in most provinces in Canada, employers don't have the automatic right to put people on a temporary layoff, but most employers assumed that they did. And they may have seen headlines saying, Air Canada lays off 24,000 people, and all these headlines, which just confirmed this idea in their mind that they had the right. So they did. And now a lot of these cases are making their way through the courts. And we're probably going to see some situations where employers are going to have liabilities. So they were trying to cut costs. They may have ended up costing themselves more money by doing something without getting proper legal advice. So I know it sounds self-serving, but I'll say, get proper legal advice, understand your rights and your options and your obligations. And then, understand, as I was saying before, make sure you're clear on what you want to do. It's not enough just to say we want to have a vaccination policy or to say we want a mandatory vaccination policy. Think about what that really means in terms of implementation. Think about the different types of workers you have, because as I said before, it doesn't have to be one size fits all. And think very specifically about how this will play out. If you have individuals who choose not to be vaccinated, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, well, then we're not going to employ you? Or what if it's one of your superstars? Are you going to be willing to be a bit more flexible? So think about how that plays out. And as well, if some of your employees cannot be vaccinated for medical or religious reasons, where you have to accommodate them, think about how you might be able to do that. So but think about the implementation and then sit down with an employment lawyer, go through all those various scenarios, and then they can put together a policy which puts on paper what you want to implement.
If you found this eye-opening, subscribe to see all the episodes and comment. Are you implementing a vaccination policy and what are you learning in doing that? Let us know in the comment section below. Next question. You've already talked about this too, or you've touched on it anyways. When is the duty to accommodate triggered for people refusing vaccinations?
Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there about that, because it's actually fairly simple, as much as any of this can be simple. So the duty to accommodate is only triggered when something relates to a ground protected by human rights legislation. So human rights legislation, as I think we all understand, relates to things like gender, relates to ethnicity, relates to disability, relates to religion. So the only two that I have seen that could possibly apply in this context are a disability, or in other words, medical condition. If you have a medical condition that prevents you from being vaccinated, then you are entitled to some sort of accommodation. You shouldn't be penalized for that. And the other potential ground that people have talked about in this context is religion or religious belief. And if there is a genuinely held religious belief that would prevent someone from being vaccinated, they would be entitled to accommodation. I've seen a lot of debate about whether there are any religions that would preclude someone from being vaccinated. I'm certainly not an expert on religion. I don't know if there are any. If there are, and the person can't just show up one day and say, I've decided to join this XYZ religion and therefore I can't be vaccinated. They've got to show that it's a legitimately held belief. So if they could show that, then they may be entitled to accommodation for that as well. In which case they are entitled to not suffer adverse consequences because of the medical condition or the religious belief. Adverse consequences obviously would include losing your job. So at that point, the employer would have to show, well, would either have to accommodate them or show that it would be impossible to accommodate them without suffering undue hardship, because that's the test. You have to accommodate them to the point of undue hardship. So that means they're going to be expected to incur some inconvenience, some cost, etc. But if it gets to the point where it's really impacting the viability of the operation, that's when they may be able to say that they can't accommodate any further.
Okay, so related question, and you kind of already answered this too. What qualifies as a sincerely held religious belief?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the Ontario Human Rights Commission actually put out a policy statement last week, basically confirming that this sort of that sort of belief does not qualify for protection under the human rights legislation. So it has to relate to a legitimate religion. And it's been interesting over the years to look at religious exemptions because, of course, religion, generally speaking, the rules might vary. And if you go and ask 3 priests or 3 rabbis, for a religious interpretation, you get 3 different answers.
Yes.
So someone doesn't have to prove that their religion says X, but they have to show it is a legitimate religion and that they have a legitimate and genuine belief, not just that they have signed on to that religion, in the last couple of weeks because they don't want to be vaccinated. So that's, there are no absolute rules as to how you determine that, but I think most tribunals and most courts are going to look at this fairly critically. And they are only going to protect someone if it is legitimate and not just an attempt to avoid vaccination.
Can you talk about the accommodations then? What kind of accommodations are people making?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's been interesting to see how the dialogue has evolved. Because, of course, think about, for the first, I'll say, year and 5 months or so of the pandemic, obviously some businesses were shut altogether, but many businesses continued to operate, but they continued to operate despite the fact there was no vaccine by implementing safety measures. So it may have been distancing, it may have been use of masks or other PPE. So that's what we're continuing to see now, where people cannot be vaccinated. So first of all, testing, mandatory testing on a regular basis to ensure the workplace is safe, but also, again, the continued use of masks, continued use of sanitizer and making sure that the workplace is clean, I should say, and also continued distancing. Office spaces are often, using some sort of a hybrid model. So people are working from home sometimes, or working in the office other times, so that you don't have too many people in the office at one time. All of these things are obviously ways to keep the workplace safe, but also ways to accommodate someone who cannot be vaccinated. And we're going to continue, I would think, to see that, because we're not going to have 100% vaccination. So there's always going to be some need for that. And I think it's important to also remember that as an employer, under occupational health and safety legislation, you have an obligation to take all reasonable steps to ensure the workplace is safe. So that might mean mandating vaccination, but it also might mean accommodations such as allowing people to not be vaccinated, but still ensuring that they are tested regularly, wearing proper safety equipment. So those are all ways that you can accommodate people who can't be vaccinated and also ensure that the workplace is safe.
So if an employer refuses the vaccine and doesn't have grounds for accommodation, and there is an actual mandatory vaccination policy in place, what happens? What happens to the employee?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So if there is a true mandatory vaccination policy in place, which says if you are not vaccinated, subject to human rights exceptions, then you will lose your job, then I guess the simple answer to your question is they'll lose their job.
Right.
The more complicated question is, something we talked about a few minutes ago, which is, are they entitled to severance or not? So if you could make the argument that the mandatory vaccination policy was reasonable, then and we're going to see some case law on this, but of course, like everything else, it takes time. It'll probably be a year or two before we have case law on this. And the question will be, would that refusal to be vaccinated constitute just cause for dismissal? I think it's going to be a fascinating evolution in the law to see how the courts treat that. Because if a court says that, yes, it is just cause, then the employee would not be entitled to any severance, any termination pay, any compensation for losing their job. Conversely, if a court doesn't think that it constituted just cause, then they would be entitled to their termination pay and their severance, which, particularly if they don't have a strong contract in place, it can be months or even years of severance. So this can have a significant cost to the employer.
All right, final question here. Employers have to put all of this in writing and have a written policy. Do you have any suggestions on where they can go to get started on it?
You can definitely give me a call. We'd be happy to help them.
Yeah.
That is how we're spending a lot of our time these days, is drafting vaccination policies. So obviously we'd be happy to help anyone, and I encourage anyone watching this to feel free to reach out and see if we can help you. But without or kidding aside, you should be working with an employment lawyer, and in many cases, it can be really efficient to work with an HR consultant or your internal HR people and an employment lawyer. So that way you can have, the person with the HR expertise do some of the drafting, but have the legal review done at the end. And you're going to want to have this legally reviewed. This is also new, and there are risks, and you don't want to expose yourself to liability. So make sure it's legally either drafted by a lawyer or at least reviewed by a lawyer that specializes in employment law. Because we see this all the time in the context of any contract or any policy. A lot of times businesses, they get them, they download them off the internet, they get them from the last job they had. They often don't even really know what's in them. They assume that certain things are in them that may not be, or the wording is such that it's not going to be enforceable anyway. So if you want to have an enforceable policy that would not expose you to potential liability or does not provide you with the safety or security that you need, you want to make sure it's that you have professionals helping you to draft it.
Well, that was the last question. Thank you so much. That was amazing and timely. I did an episode on bullying and harassment, and that episode link is right here. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.